Life at sea. During the 1200s, overseas journeys were long and difficult. Crew members were faced with many dangers, such as storms, diminishing food and supplies, and attacks from pirates who robbed ships and murdered their crews. Background. The Polos used a device called an astrolabe to measure the altitude of the sun or stars. The ship's position was determined by focusing on a known star. Navigation in the 1200s. Dead reckoning. The position of the ship was calculated by measuring the course and distance sailed from a known point. Celestial navigation. Judging the ship's position based on the sun or the stars is called celestial navigation. The ships. Historians are not certain what type of ship the Polos used to sail home to Italy from Asia. Some believe they sailed in a large, fast ship called a galley. Galleys were long and narrow and were powered by oars and sometimes sails. During the Middle Ages, galleys were armed with weapons and a crew of rowers and were used as warships. Merchants also sailed in galleys laden with goods to trade in other countries. Above. During the Middle Ages, many sailors believed that whales were deadly sea monsters. In this book, Marco described the severe damage that whales caused to ships at sea. Millet. While in Asia, Marco Polo found that the Mongols often used millet in their cooking. Millet is a small grain that has a mild flavor. Here's how you can make your own millet. 1 cup millet, 2 cups water, 1 teaspoon olive oil, 1/4 teaspoon salt. 1. Rinse the millet and drain in a strainer. 2. Put millet in a saucepan with the water, olive oil, and salt and bring to a boil. 3. Reduce the heat and cover the saucepan with the lid. Let it simmer for about 20 minutes or until all the water is absorbed. 4. Turn off the heat and let it sit for 5 minutes. 5. Fluff the millet with a fork. Enjoy. Below. Many people wrongly believe that Marco Polo discovered macaroni and ice cream in China and introduced them to Europe when he returned to Italy. In his book, Marco compared a type of pasta eaten by the Chinese to lasagna or macaroni. He also wrote of a form of dried milk that the Mongols ate for energy before battle. Hardships. Aboard ship, rats and cockroaches swarmed everywhere, and the smell of bilge water and rotting wood made it difficult to breathe. Sailors ate meat and fish that were dried and salted so that they would not spoil. They also ate a type of biscuit called hardtack, cheese, vinegar, garlic, and onions. Many sailors died from illnesses, such as scurvy, which was a common disease caused by lack of vitamin C found in fresh fruits and vegetables. The captain of the ship slept in his own cabin, but the crew had to sleep on deck or in the ship's hold, the area below deck, among the food and other supplies. Background. Ship's boys were responsible for keeping track of time, cooking and serving hot meals to the sailors, leading morning prayers, and scrubbing the decks. Quadrant. A quadrant was a device used to determine a ship's latitude or how far north or south it was. One arm of the instrument was aligned with the horizon and the other arm was aligned with the sun or stars. The greater the angle, the further the ship was from the equator or the imaginary belt around the center of the earth. Left. Cockroaches, weevils, and rats often infested the ship's food supplies. The Mongol Empire. The Mongols' vast empire stretched from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe. When Kublai Khan conquered northern China in 1271, China became part of his empire and influenced the Mongolian way of life. Mongol government. Mongol tribes were led by a king called a Khan. The Khan was elected by the tribe leaders at gatherings called Ha-Uraltais. The Mongol Empire consisted of a committee of leaders called Kurultai, who met with the Khan to discuss issues involving Mongol lands and to ensure that tribes were not fighting one another. The Mongols were governed by a code of law called Yasa, and penalties for not obeying the laws were severe, including death. Above. The Mongol cavalry was made up of archers and swordsmen on horseback. Mongol warriors were gifted horsemen who moved quicker than their enemies did on foot. Mongol homes. Mongol homes, called yurts, were round tents made from felt and canvas tied over wooden frames. Smoke from cooking and heating fires escaped through a hole in the roof called a shangrek. Beaten cow or pony dung mixed with sand served as a foundation for the floor. Wealthy Mongol families hung felt rugs on the walls for protection against the cold during winter. In the summer, they hung screens made of reeds on yurt walls to keep out dust and insects. Yurts had no windows and the door was made of a felt flap. Learning from the Chinese. After becoming the Emperor of China in 1260, Kublai Khan learned of many Chinese technologies. He learned how to extract asbestos from rock to produce candle wicks and cloth. The Mongols used coal to produce fire after seeing the Chinese heat their baths with it, and adopted the Chinese use of paper money instead of gold and silver coins. Kublai Khan also borrowed a message delivery system from the Chinese called the Imperial Post. Messengers carried mail over long distances on horseback and stopped at stations called yams every 25 to 30 miles to stock up on food and water. Stations were also located every 3 miles for foot runners or messengers who traveled short distances on foot. Above. The accumulation of smoke stains around the shangraks or roof's holes edges represented the long life of a Mongol family. When the yurt became worn and was rebuilt, the shangrak was kept and passed down from father to son. Below. In this book, Marco explained that the Mongols made sheets of paper from the bark of the mulberry tree. They were cut into pieces and used as money. Left. Kublai Khan hunted wild game such as bear, boar, and deer with the help of trained falcons, cheetahs, leopards, dogs, and lynxes. Food. The Mongols were a nomadic people who moved their homes from place to place in search of food, water, and grazing land for their cattle. Meat was an important part of their diet. They hunted deer and caught mice and rats. They cooked meat over fires fueled by horse or cow dung and wood, or they ate it raw. During the summer, the Mongols ate leeks, wild onions, hazelnuts, and fruits such as juniper berries, wild apples, and cherries. They drank fermented mare and camel milk called kumis, and used the milk to make curds, yogurt, and cheese. Below, each Mongol tribe had a male shaman or doctor called a Boj and a female shaman called an Indigan. They drove away evil spirits, communicated with the gods, and told fortunes. Roles. Mongol women made felt, cooked, raised the children, and sewed clothing, shoes, and bags from animal hides. They were trained to use weapons to defend their herds of cattle from predatory animals. Women were respected in Mongol society and were able to inherit property and divorce their husbands. Most Mongol men were warriors skillfully trained to use bows and arrows, swords, and knives. Mongol boys were taught to ride horses in preparation for future battles. Mongol beliefs and religion. The Mongols believed in many gods that they prayed to for help and approval. Their supreme being was a sky god named Everlasting Blue Sky, who ruled over nature deities or gods of the natural world. They often made animal sacrifices to their gods at mounds of stones and on top of hills. The Mongols placed idols of their gods made of silk and felt in carts outside their yurts to protect their homes. They also hung idols over the beds of the sick to cure them. When they killed an animal, they offered its heart to the idols. Chinese junks. The Mongols sailed in large Chinese ships called junks. Most junks were made of teak wood. Each junk had 3 to 5 masts and a curved sail framed with bamboo poles, which propelled the ships and allowed them to sail very fast. Junks required a crew of about 300, and some had sweeps or oars, each manned by 4 seamen. They were built with many watertight bulkheads that protected the ship from sinking if it hit a rock or was struck by a whale. Some junks had up to 60 cabins below the deck, which had sleeping quarters and compartments to store food and other goods. Below, for the Polo's trip home, Kublai Khan prepared a fleet of 14 Chinese junks stocked with provisions to last for 2 years. After Marco Polo, nobody would ever know Marco Polo's fantastic tales of adventure and exploration if Marco had not returned to Italy and written a book. There are many myths about the voyage, and some of them were invented by Marco himself. Welcome home. A popular legend tells that upon returning to Italy and presenting themselves to their relatives, the Polos were not recognized at all. They were dressed in clothes that were soiled and tattered from their voyage, and they had aged since they had embarked on their journey to the Orient 25 years earlier. The Polos tore open their robes to reveal the precious jewels they had hidden. Their family then believed their story and welcomed them back into the family. Below. At first, Kublai Khan was reluctant to allow the Polos to leave his empire. He only consented when they promised to return. Marco Polo was 17 years old when he left Venice and 41 when he returned. Imprisoned. In 1296, Marco joined the Venetian army in a battle against Genoa for control of the Mediterranean Sea as a trade route. During a battle near the island of Carzola in the Adriatic Sea, he was captured by the Genoans and put in prison. There, he met a fellow prisoner named Rustichello of Pisa. For the next 3 years, Rustichello and Marco wrote a book of Marco's adventures in Asia entitled Description of the World. Marco was set free from prison in 1299 when Genoa and Venice signed a peace treaty. Marco il Milione. Many Europeans who read Marco's book believed it was full of lies. Marco and his book became nicknamed Marco il Milione, or Marco Millions, because it was said that Marco was a man with a million invented stories. To other Europeans, Marco's accounts of the peoples of the East showed that they were alike in many ways. 1295. The Polos return home to Venice, Italy. 1296. Marco Polo is imprisoned in Genoa, Italy. 1298. Marco Polo and Rustichello write description of the world. 1299. Venice and Genoa sign a peace treaty. Above, Rustichello was a writer who enjoyed Marco's stories of his adventures in Asia. For 3 years, he and Marco set down the Polo's adventures on paper. The Age of Exploration. Marco Polo carried word of China's scientific and cultural advances back to Europe. His tales of the great wealth to be found in Asia inspired other Europeans to travel outside of Europe. Merchants and explorers ventured to China, India, and the Moluccas, or Spice Islands, in search of valuable trade goods such as silk, gold, and spices, including pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. Above right, Europeans sailed to Asia for valuable spices. In Europe, spices were used to make medicines and hide the taste of salted meat. 1325. Muslim explorer Ibn Battuta travels in Asia and Africa for 30 years. 1492. Italian explorer Christopher Columbus, above, sails the Atlantic Ocean and reaches America, which he believes to be Asia. 1570s. Explorer Martin Frobisher searches unsuccessfully for a sea passage from Europe to the Orient. Right. The Cantillon Atlas is a map of the world drawn in 1375. That illustrates Marco Polo's ideas about the geography of Asia. Illustrations based on his stories decorate the map. The Mongols. In the years following the Polos' stay in Asia, the Mongol Empire crumbled. Many Chinese resented the Mongol emperors. In 1368, a Buddhist scholar named Ming Tai-su organized an army and forced the Mongols from China. Ming Tai-su rose to the throne to become the first ruler of the Ming dynasty. The Mongols were completely expelled from China by 1382, ending the reign of the largest empire the world had ever seen. Below. Once driven out of China, the Mongols continued to harass the Chinese, but were unable to reconquer China. Marco Polo's legacy. Marco Polo's book continues to be read today, and his adventures have made him one of the most important and famous travelers in history. Marco's controversial book. Today, many historians believe that much of Marco Polo's book is untrue, and that he did not visit China. This is because he failed to mention important features of China, such as the Great Wall, tea, Chinese calligraphy, and writing, chopsticks, or the binding of women's feet. Marco also did not use Chinese words in his book, but used Mongol and Turkish words instead. Other historians argue that Marco's omissions can be explained and that his detailed descriptions of China's currency, imperial post, and use of silkworms and coal prove that he had been there. Below. While in Badakhshan, Marco Polo saw large horned wild sheep, which were named Ovis Poli, or Marco Polo's sheep, in his honor. Background. Some historians believe that at the time Marco Polo was in China, the Great Wall was in ruins due to Mongolian battles and did not look impressive enough to be mentioned in his book of travels. Polo's writings. The information on events and people in this book are based on Marco Polo's writings. Today, some historians question the facts presented in his reports. Artwork. There were no cameras or video recording equipment during the medieval period. The artwork in this book was created later by artists who were not present at the events. For this reason, the events may not have happened exactly as they appear in this book, but in styles that were popular during an artist's lifetime. Right. One legend says that on his deathbed, a priest asked Marco Polo whether he wanted to admit that some of his stories were untrue. Marco answered, "I did not tell half of what I saw, for I knew I would not be believed."